Thanks for being here. Can you all hear me? Yes? So for the last 3 weeks, I've watched journalists, politicians, and unfortunately even some scholars mislead and confuse the public about this topic. So I'm grateful for the chance to address basically 3 questions. And these will basically be an introduction to what other more distinguished scholars will go into after me. So question 1, we're supposed to be talking about executive action, so we should define what that is. You should think of it very simply. An executive action is just an order to a bureaucrat. Sometimes you see the president dressing it up and signing a document. Sometimes they're talking to a bureaucrat behind closed doors. It doesn't matter. It's just a president ordering bureaucrats to do stuff. Okay? Now, that way of doing things, making policy, has one upside, one key downside. The upside is that the president gets to go first. Okay? Right? Think about chess or checkers. If I go first, I have a strategic advantage. Right? If the president goes first, that forces everybody else to figure out how to stop him, basically. Okay? So, and the people who might stop him are people like Congress who have trouble overcoming their own disagreements, or it might be courts who tend to act pretty slowly. Okay? So that's a key advantage. Okay? There's also a key disadvantage, which is that executive actions are often expensive to enforce. Okay? And I don't mean in terms of money, so let me explain this a little bit. So when Congress passes a law, changes a policy, okay, it obligates the government to either do something or not do something, okay? And if they don't follow through on that obligation, you all can sue them, usually, right? So that, as a consequence, there are firms, right, private businesses, right, there's universities, state governments, all watching the federal government to see that they follow through and actually do what Congress tells them to do, okay? So the way you should think about that is that what the Congress is doing is it's outsourcing its own enforcement, right? It's reducing the cost of forcing bureaucrats to do the stuff that it asked them to. Now, when the president does this, they can't outsource, right? Because they don't create new laws. They don't create new rights that you can enforce, okay? So that means they have to figure out a way to enforce it themselves, okay? And that can be expensive in terms of their own effort and energy, okay? So that might sound like an academic distinction, but it's actually pretty important for the third question that I'm going to talk about, which is, under what conditions is this strategy likely to be successful? Okay, so that's question 1. What is executive action? Now you know its upside and its downside. Question 2, what is different about this administration? Okay, what's different about what the Trump administration and how they're using executive action? Okay, so let me start by telling you what is not different, because this seems to be confusing people. Okay, it is not abnormal for presidents, especially of the last 30 years, to use ambiguous laws to change policy. Okay, that's very normal. So let me give you an example. So over the last 10 years, in particular, DEI has become an important part of how government and institutions like the University of Michigan work. Okay. Now, is there a law enacted by Congress that says that the executive branch needs to adopt DEI principles in the way that it manages itself? No, there isn't. Okay? Those changes originated in the executive branch. There they can also be destroyed, okay? Which is what's happening right now. The same can be said for dozens of other executive actions that the Biden administration signed, which the Trump administration has now revoked. And I think a fair reading of history would show that Democrats have tended to take advantage of ambiguous laws more than Republican presidents. Okay. So that's not different. What is? There's 2 differences. The first difference is that political wins for the Trump administration are the first and most important objective. Okay. So to greenlight an executive action, people in the administration basically need to be able to answer one question, which is, does this help us politically? Okay? So now think back to 8 years ago, 2017. Around this time, we were a couple of weeks into the administration. They had already signed the first version of the travel ban, which closed down immigration to a couple of Muslim-majority countries. Okay? So the first version of that directive might as well have been written in crayon. Okay? It had to be rewritten 3 times. Okay? It caused chaos at airports, and it was basically all anyone could talk about for a couple of weeks. Okay? Now, we now know that the author of that directive was Stephen Miller, and that's important because that is the man who is now determining whether an executive action gets green light. He's the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. Okay? So he was not fired for incompetence, he was promoted, right? That tells you what the Trump administration values about executive action. Okay? So today, they've hastily expanded a detention center at Guantanamo Bay, which will cost orders of magnitude more to actually construct than normal. They've released reservoir water in California for no conceivable purpose. Okay? They attempted to freeze all federal spending without adequate warning or preparation. Any president could have done those things, but for the second Trump administration, making political waves seems to be the point. The volume and pace is designed to give you the impression that this is a president who can do anything. And if you walked in today with that impression, the first thing that I want to tell you is that behind these actions, you will find carelessness, you'll find a disregard for process, and you'll find a tendency to overextend themselves in ways that leave the president potentially vulnerable to failure in the future. Okay, that's the first difference. The second difference is that many of the Trump administration's actions are designed to be illegal. Now, I have to explain this because I'm not giving you a legal opinion. There are other lawyers here who will talk to you about the law. I'm saying something about the president's strategy here, okay? So President Trump today is not fundamentally different than he was 8 years ago, okay? He doesn't have different ideas about policy. The main difference is that he's surrounded by people who will sign off on actions even when they suspect that their actions might later be determined to be unlawful, okay? So he's always believed that birthright citizenship was bad. He's always wanted to have an executive order ending it. The difference today is that there are lawyers around him who will write and sign off on an order that almost any other order would think to be illegal, okay? President Trump has always thought that he should be able to fire anyone who he wants, right? That is basically how most Americans learned who he was, right? Through his reality television show. The difference today is that he now has advisors telling him to just do it and force others to stop him, okay? So I've read thousands of these actions. I've written a book on it. I don't think that there's any president in history who has cared more about political appearances and cared less, or at least had a higher risk tolerance for legal risk. Okay, so those are the important differences. Last question. So what will make this strategy successful, right? Their strategy is now obvious, right? In fact, they've been telegraphing it for months, right, before they even took office, okay? So now you have to imagine yourself to be the Trump administration. Your strategy is, I'm going to move first over and over again. I'm going to do it as fast as I can. By going as fast as I can, I'm sacrificing and disregarding some preparations that other administrations would have taken. Most of my orders pose significant legal risk. I've only got a couple thousand people who I can actually trust. And I've taken executive action across the board. I've spared no policy area, right? Which I think is a fair assessment. So now you have to remember the disadvantage of executive action, which is that at the end of the day, it's just an order to a bureaucrat. So if you yourself, as the president, actually had to enforce all of those orders and make sure that they were complied with, it would be very expensive. You'd quickly run out of bandwidth. So what you're hoping for then is pretty simple. You hope that people will follow your orders without being forced to. Right? So the success of executive action depends on people believing in it. Right? You all believe that those chairs will hold you in your seats. I can tell on the basis of your behavior. Right? So President Trump's executive actions depend on courts, everyday people, businesses, this university, and other organizations acting as if the president actually has the power that he claims that he does. Okay? I think that's important to point out because as I speak, right, media organizations are actively creating that impression. Every headline that you read, okay? So if you pulled up the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, right, let alone Newsmax or Fox News or something like that, you'll read about the president steamrolling Washington, about the blizzard of executive orders. All of those headlines are effectively creating the narrative that the president and his advisors need in order for their strategy to be successful. So under what conditions would the Trump administration's executive actions fail? Well, I think it starts basically with things like tonight, right? You have to have a more accurate knowledge about how limited their power is, okay? And effectively, the opposition would have to force the administration to use its energy to make people comply with their directives, right? Because by opening up dozens of different policy processes, you potentially tax your staff's time and energy. They have to bet that people will make it easy on them, right? People need to believe there will be punishments if they don't voluntarily comply in advance, right? So in a way, risk aversion is the president's best friend, okay? So I'll leave you with the following, which is that there's a word in the English language for people who are extremely risk averse. It's coward. It's been pretty obvious to me for years what a second Trump administration would be. And I think over the next 4 years, we'll all find out what everyone else is. Thank you.